Good morning, friends. Today we'll be starting a series of classes on one of the most important diseases which affects our country, and one of the most important diseases from your examination point of view, most important disease, whether it be considered from the public health point of view in India, and the most important disease which will come to your OPDs once you pass out from here. Tuberculosis. And tuberculosis is a disease which has been with us for ages. We have tried to control this disease. We have had some success, but we do have problems in controlling the disease, as we will talk about in the subsequent classes. This series of classes could have gone on for 10 or more classes, but I will try and restrict it to 3 or 4 classes. I'll try and finish off tuberculosis in 3 or 4 classes. I would like you to read a lot about tuberculosis, because that's a disease which you people are going to face. And we keep on talking today of COVID. COVID has how many deaths in a day? 300? Well, in tuberculosis, we are talking about 1,000 deaths a day in our country. Every single day since the past so many years, rather we have now controlled it, so we are having about 1,000 deaths a day. Otherwise, we have been having much more deaths than this. So let's see, let's have an overview about tuberculosis. Tuberculosis is a worldwide chronic communicable bacterial disease, as you are aware, and the tuberculosis disease is the outcome between a fight between the virulence of the organism and the resistance of the body. So let's go on to a little bit of a historical perspective. 1882, Robert Koch, a German scientist, discovered rod-shaped bacteria causing tuberculosis on 24th of March 1882. I mentioned this date, 24th March, because that is the day that we now celebrate as the World Tuberculosis Day. And this World Tuberculosis Day, from 2005 onwards, the WHO has put this particular tag, World Stop TB Day. World Stop TB Day it's called. So please remember this. This can keep coming in your multiple choice questions in your exit exams. You can note this down and keep it 24th March, remember, as World Stop TB Day. 1921, we had the French scientist Calmet and Guerin discovered the vaccine against tuberculosis. Is this vaccine effective? We will talk about it in the future, but let me just give you a gist that BCG, as we call it, Bacilli Calmette-Guerin, given to all children in our country at birth, is not as effective as one may think. It is good for childhood tuberculosis, but for adult tuberculosis, it does not have very much effect. BCG is controversial when you look at it right through the world. In Africa, you have BCG does not have very much effect. Well, we'll talk about it in future. 1944, we had Salman Waxman and colleagues who discovered the miracle drugs, streptomycin, which changed the course of tuberculosis. In 1946, we had drugs like isoniazid and PAS, which were introduced. And PAS was considered one of the very important drugs to be used. Unfortunately, we had to consume in gram, in almost a handful had to be consumed. It created problems. At the present moment, PAS has gone out of favor. Isoniazid is very much being used. In 1960, National Tuberculosis Institute was established at Bangalore to formulate a comprehensive national tuberculosis control program. So 1960 onwards, we've been trying we have a program which is there for controlling tuberculosis. It went through various phases. There was the National Tuberculosis Control Program. After that, we had the revised National Tuberculosis Control Program, and then after that, that has now come to an elimination program. We will talk about these in the future. In 1962, we had this Government of India launched the National Tuberculosis Control Program. In 1966, again, the miracle drug rifampicin was introduced, and this particular drug rifampicin has changed the course of tuberculosis. We have now been able to decrease the amount of time which is required for treating tuberculosis. Rifampicin is used in very many important programs. One is this program, and second is in the leprosy control program. So we'll talk about that once I come to leprosy. In 1972, Wallace Fox he decided rifampicin and pyrazinamide along with isoniazid should be used, and this would reduce the treatment to 6 months. Earlier we were giving treatment for tuberculosis for 18 months. So only in 1972 the policy was brought around to reduce this treatment to 6 months. So it was called the short course chemotherapy. In 1993, WHO declared tuberculosis as a global emergency with the emergence of HIV. You see, HIV and tuberculosis were coming together. Today also, many institutions, once a patient tests for HIV, he is also tested for tuberculosis and vice versa. So the NTCP was then renamed as the Revised National Tuberculosis Control Program. If you look at the problem around the world, you have a huge number of cases. You have about 10.4 million cases which take place, 10.4 million cases, and 1.8 million deaths which occur. And deaths due to HIV is about 0.4 million. So you have a large number of cases and deaths that are taking place all over the world because of tuberculosis. And the main contributor for that is because of the fact that we are having problems even with treatment, with drug resistance creeping in. And we have multi-drug resistant tuberculosis, and now what we call an XDR, that is an extremely drug resistant tuberculosis. We will talk about it in future. So tuberculosis generally, we will be talking about the sex distribution a little later, but then let me just tell you that 57% of cases are in males and 34% in females. 9% of cases occur in children, and these children are very vulnerable group. Their treatment is a problem, and we must look at it separately. If you look at how much is our contribution to tuberculosis, this was much larger earlier. We used to contribute almost 50% of the cases of tuberculosis worldwide. We have now managed to decrease it to about 27%, and we shouldn't be proud of it because of the fact that we need to decrease this further and bring it down to a level where tuberculosis is not a public health problem in the country. Well, if you start looking at the deaths due to tuberculosis, you have 17% of tuberculosis deaths taking place, and that is not a very good figure. Well, this is a slightly older slide, but it really gives you the picture which is there. If you start looking at that, we have about 2.8 million new cases. It's a very large number, 2.8 million new cases every year, and about 4,80,000 deaths every year. 4,80,000 deaths. Nowadays, it is said about 3,70,000 deaths, coming to say 1,000 deaths a day. Yes, TB causes 1,000 deaths a day in our country. So when you look at worldwide, you have TB killing about 5,000 people a day, 2 to 3 million each year. 1/3 of the world's population is infected with tuberculosis. Now, one has to differentiate between infection and disease. Infection and disease. Whether a person has got the tuberculous bacilli in him, that is infection. And once he suffers from symptoms, that is disease. I am telling you this now, I will keep repeating it because I would like you to remember this. TB kills more young women than any other disease. India is the highest TB burden country in the world and accounts for nearly 1/5 of the global burden of tuberculosis and 2/3 of the cases in the Southeast Asian region of the WHO. 2/3 of the cases in the Southeast Asian region. One should take it also with a little bit of, one shouldn't get depressed about the fact, because of the fact that we also contribute 2/3 of the population of this side of the world. So we have, as you know, what is the population of the country? 1.3 billion. 1.3 billion. We are a very large, very populous country. So we do have these problems which occur. Every year approximately 1.8 million persons develop tuberculosis, of which 0.8 million are new smear positive and highly infectious. Anybody who is smear positive, who is letting out tuberculous bacilli, is infectious, and that is a problem. They can infect others. The annual risk of becoming infected with tuberculosis is about 1.5%, and once infected, there is 10% lifetime risk of developing tuberculosis disease. 2 out of every 5 Indians are infected with tuberculosis bacilli. Yes. So if you look at your class of say 150 students, you will find how many? At least 60 of them are having tuberculosis, are infected with tuberculosis. Every one of us. So you find about 2 out of every 5 Indians have got the tubercle bacilli with them. And every day about 5,000 people develop the disease. Patients with the infectious pulmonary tuberculosis disease can infect about 10 to 15 persons in a year. So what do we mean by infectious pulmonary tuberculosis? In a sense, we mean infectious pulmonary tuberculosis when there is an open case of tuberculosis. The person has got tuberculosis in his sputum, which he can transmit to others. Today, in today's COVID environment, we are well aware that respiratory diseases are transmitted by the oropharyngeal route. And all these respiratory diseases have R0 factor which is there. We will talk about, we have spoken about R0 when we were talking epidemiology, and you have I'm sure you have conveniently forgotten about it. So R0 basically is how many persons can this one patient infect, and so this is in tuberculosis we have one patient infecting about 10 to 15 persons a year. In R0 we are not talking about a year. In this case we are talking about in a year. In India almost 0.37 million people, as I said, 370,000 people die every year, coming to 10,000 people per day. Today's India's, we have the directly observed treatment short term, DOTS, directly observed treatment short term. India's DOTS program against tuberculosis is one of the fastest expanding programs. We covered this, we launched it in 1997, and we had covered the whole country by 2006. DOTS program is as you mentioned, nowadays we have treatment for 6 months, short-term chemotherapy, and when you are able to give the treatment to this individual directly, it is directly observed by someone, that is what is DOTS, directly observed treatment short-term. Okay, so we have about 7.3 million patients on DOTS treatment, and that would have suffered a lot during this COVID time, when people were not able to directly observe the treatment being taken by tuberculosis patients. We will see the repercussion of this in months to come, and hope that people have been taking treatment even during this COVID time. The death rate under RNTCP has been cut 7-fold. It was very high earlier, 29% it was, and so now it has come down to 4% in smear positive cases. So 4% is also quite a lot. When you start looking at the large figures which we have, 4% is quite a lot. But maybe with the new guidelines, we have some new guidelines which have come up in the year 2018, and with the daily regime coming in, maybe the treatment will improve, or dropouts will decrease. Mainly deaths used to occur because people used to not take the treatment well continuously, and they used to drop out after patients became a little better. So in 2006, the program had achieved a case detection rate of about 66% against the global target of 70%. So that was quite good, but we have sort of lived on our laurels, and we have not gone further. The main problem is that people coming to the governmental sector are being treated, but people who are in the private sector, they are the ones who are not being reported upon. The dropouts are very heavy in the private sector. So we need some mechanism. We have some mechanisms which have now been developed. Let us see, we'll talk about it later. Treatment success achieved consistently is about 85%. 85% of those people who are registered. So we have a case detection of 66%. So 66% of our cases are detected. Out of those 66%, 85% are consistent in their treatment. Still we have 15% dropout. Rather, dropouts a little bit more, but government data says 85%. Every day, when we look at it, every day more than 20,000 people become infected with tuberculosis. Worldwide, we have 5,000 people who develop the disease. More than 1,000 people die of the disease. Worldwide, if you're looking at 2 people die per minute. About 80 working days are lost per year per case, because people get various complications or become worse as far as tuberculosis is concerned, and they are unable to work. If they are unable to work, they are unable to get their salaries. If they are unable to get their salaries, they are unable to eat. If they are unable to eat well, then they will be malnutritioned, and if they are malnutritioned, the TB bacilli will have a romping day on the individual and will further aggravate the disease. So it's a cycle which is there, which is very unfortunate, and again, because the disease becomes worse, he can still not go for work. So it's a complete cycle which is there, and this cycle is the biggest problem in tuberculosis. What's the agent? Agent is tubercle bacilli. You have already read about it in your microbiology. Mycobacterium tuberculosis, commonly known as Cox bacillus. It is an acid-fast bacillus, which is another acid-fast bacillus which we are very concerned about. That is Mycobacterium leprae. We will be talking about it later on once we finish off with the respiratory diseases. So Mycobacterium tuberculosis was identified first in 1882 by Koch in Berlin, and it was not immediately recognized as the cause of all forms of tuberculosis. The concept of latent infection developed in 1920 from studies in Norway, what I mean by latent is a person who has tuberculosis infection but is not having the disease. What is the source of infection? The main source of infection is 2. One is a human source with Mycobacterium tuberculosis, and a bovine source of Mycobacterium bovis. You see, milk in our country, as we mentioned, we have approximately 2 out of 5 people who have tuberculosis infection. What about animals? In animals also, the infection is a little bit more. You can say almost 3 out of 5 animals in our country are infected with tuberculosis. A large quantity, because we don't have a huge tuberculosis control program in animals. So, Mycobacterium bovis will be present in many of these cows which give milk. So, what do we expect? That we have a huge number of patients in our country who have tuberculosis due to Mycobacterium bovis. But this does not take place. Why? Can you think of why? Why we do not get Mycobacterium bovis tuberculosis so often? Because of the simple and very good habit which we have in our country. Even if we get a pasteurized milk bag, we'll cut the bag, pour the milk in the container and boil the milk. Excellent thing which we do, which has come down from generations. Possibly earlier generations, we had a system by which people were boiling the milk to not get Mycobacterium bovis. But this is being continued even with pasteurized milk, which is a good thing. We do not know how good the pasteurization has taken place, and we boil our milk. And once the milk is boiled, the Mycobacterium bovis get killed. So the chances of Indians getting Mycobacterium bovis tuberculosis is less. I don't say is not there, is less. There are many poor people who cannot boil their milk, and these are the people with poor immunity who tend to get Mycobacterium bovis tuberculosis. And that is a problem because many of the drugs are the Mycobacterium bovis tuberculosis, many of the drugs are resistant. So we will not be talking much about Mycobacterium bovis tuberculosis. We will be talking about resistant tuberculosis, in which we will discuss about this fact. Age. The data in India shows that tuberculin positivity rate increases steadily with age. Nothing very spectacular. As you grow older, you come more in contact with people who have tuberculosis, who may have latent tuberculosis, or who may have tuberculosis and still are walking around in the community. You are more likely to get infected with tuberculosis. So at 0 to 14 years, the prevalence of infection is about 2%. And 15 to 24 years, the prevalence of infection is 20%, 1/5, or 21, almost 21%, 1/5 of the population. More in males, as I said earlier, nutrition plays a part. I mentioned it earlier. You have poor nutrition, a person who is unable to consume enough proteins. If he doesn't consume enough protein, he will go into hyperproteinemia. Hyperproteinemia, if he has less of immunoglobulins. If he has less of immunoglobulins, he is more likely to get infected with tuberculosis. It's a chain, it's a cycle which takes place. Incubation period is a little variable, but as you learned in your when you did your microbiology, you could culture Mycobacterium tuberculosis in 3 to 6 weeks, and so you can. The incubation period is also considered to be 3 to 6 weeks. So the incubation period generally is about 3 to 6 weeks, and then the person may go into a latent phase. What happens? You have studied it microbiology, rather you've studied it also in physiology, I think. What happens when a person gets infected with tubercle bacilli? We'll just discuss that. Humans are the main reservoirs of the infection. The period of communicability is as long as the bacilli are excreted in the sputum. So if there's an open case, you don't treat the case, the patient will continue to be passing the sputum, passing the bacteria in his sputum. So it will carry on till the time you treat the patient. Effective and anti-tuberculosis treatment reduces the infectivity by 90% within 48 hours. So effective, so effective. Actually, we'll talk about this. You give rifampicin to the individual and the person becomes non-infective within 48 hours. So that is how effective it is, and that is the reason why all of you must remember this, that you have to think about chemoprophylaxis and what will happen to the contacts. We'll talk about all these things in the future, but people tend to neglect this portion of tuberculosis, chemoprophylaxis, and the fact that giving rifampicin to an individual will cut the infectivity by 90% within 48 hours. So TB is a social disease with medical aspects. You see, as I mentioned, it's a total cycle with poor quality of life, poor housing, overcrowding, population explosion. The chances of transmission become better. The more people congregated together, a person who has got a respiratory disease will transmit. Where it's not only tuberculosis, any respiratory disease, whenever there is overcrowding, whenever there is a population explosion, wherever there is poor quality of life, wherever there is poor nutrition, the immunity will go down. They will get all the diseases, including tuberculosis. See, as I mentioned, undernutrition, very important factor. Undernutrition. Lack of education. Education is not only physical, your physical education, whether he is done his 10th, 12th. It is lack of education, health education also. Today, in the COVID scenario, one is very much aware that respiratory infections are transmitted and we must wear a mask for preventing this. But why is it that earlier we never bothered about it? When we had a cold, we used to still come to the college and still not wear a mask. Respiratory diseases are transmitted by the oropharyngeal route, by droplet methods, and so if we have a respiratory disease, we must wear a mask. If you do not want to get a respiratory disease, you must wear a mask. That's very essential. So lack of education, and also those people who are not educated as far as the schooling is concerned, they tend to be uneducated from the health education point of view. Large families will result in poor nutrition, lack of awareness of the disease. That is what we are talking about. Education, health education. Social stigmas, tuberculosis and leprosy, two diseases which had strong social stigma. The moment a patient of tuberculosis was there in the society, he used to be neglected, he used to be not given enough food, he used to be thrown out of the house. So you have the social stigma taking place, and social stigma will result in again the person being neglected and having malnutrition. As we know, all droplet infections are transmitted by coughing, speaking, laughing, sneezing, singing. Singing also. But basically, mostly it is transmitted by coughing and sneezing. If a person is, as we know in this COVID environment, 1 meter is the distance which is required when you if you're speaking and you are more than 1 meter away, the chances of the droplet reaching are poorer. But when you sneeze, the droplet can be transmitted even up to 3 meters or more. Coughing and sneezing transmits the bacilli to a very long distance, so one has to be careful. The bacilli attack the lungs. The prevalence of infection, as we mentioned, is to the tune of 30% of the population. That means people would have had the bacilli inhaled and some initial reaction which took place. The body then came, defense mechanism came on and prevented him from reaching into a disease. For the prevalence of disease is 4 per 1,000. The incidence of infection is 1 to 2%. The incidence of disease is 1 per 1,000. It's not very less, 1 per 1,000. So how can you detect whether a person has an infection? The prevalence of infection can be detected with what we call a tuberculin test. And the prevalence of disease can be found out when a person brings out in his sputum the Mycobacterium tuberculosis or the acid-fast bacilli. Tuberculin was developed as a form of treatment. Actually, what they thought was that as it may be a type of a vaccine, tuberculin was developed, which could be introduced into the body and could fight the tubercle bacilli. So tuberculin was invented by Koch in 1891. Then later it was from 1891 to 1907 it was being tried out as a treatment. But von Pirquet in 1907 he used it as a diagnostic test. It's a complex mix of antigens which are there, you can read up about it, and it has been internationally standardized, and we'll see how it is used. This is a very common short note which comes in your exam: Mantoux tuberculin test, Mantoux test or tuberculin test. Tuberculin skin test, that's why we are calling it TST. So it's not a short form for test. The tuberculin skin test, TST. So skin test that produces a delayed type of hypersensitivity reaction in persons with Mycobacterium tuberculosis. So what do? We do the skin test which is there. We will talk about how it is done. Basically, it's used for determining how many people in a group of people are infected. So when we are talking about contact investigation, or examining the persons who have symptoms of tuberculosis. Earlier we used to have a time test. Same thing was used with multiple punctures, a time test, which was found to be inaccurate and is now not recommended. So what do? We take 0.1 ml of 5 tuberculin unit of the protein purified derivative, PPD, protein purified derivative tuberculin solution, which is introduced intradermally on the volar aspect. You know what's the volar aspect? The front of the volar surface of the lower arm, and generally we use this 27 gauge needle. It will produce a wheel of 6 to 10 millimeters in diameter. I am covering tuberculin test in detail because it comes so often in the exam. Then you measure the reaction in 48 to 72 hours. You measure the induration, not the erythema. You please remember, measure the induration. The erythema will be there, erythema may be much more, but you measure the induration. Record reaction in millimeters, not negative or positive. Let the physician decide whether it is negative or positive, because you have a lot of things we'll discuss about it. There are a lot of places where a negative reaction may be counted as positive, or a positive reaction may be taken as negative. Ensure the trained healthcare professional measures this induration. A positive test which is there, test reaction, can be measured for up to 7 days, and the negative reaction can be read accurately for up to 72 hours. So what is the reaction? In Mantoux test, when you've given the injection and then you're reading it, less than 5 millimeters is considered negative. 5 to 9 millimeters is considered borderline, and greater than 10 millimeters is considered positive. But there are many ifs and buts to this. And what are these ifs and buts? Okay, 5 mm in duration is interpreted as positive. The ifs and buts we are talking about. 5 mm in duration is considered as positive if the person is HIV infected, if he is a close contact to an infectious tuberculosis patient, or if he is a person with chest radiographs consistent with prior untreated tuberculosis. So in all these cases, the 5 mm in duration is also considered positive. Also, if the person is organ transplant recipient, that means he would be on immunosuppressive drugs or other immunosuppressed patients. Example, those taking the equivalent of more than 15 milligrams of prednisone for 1 month, or with TNF antagonists which are there. So many immunosuppressed patients which are there. A 10 mm in duration is interpreted as positive, which means that the person is exposed to tubercular infection. If it is positive below the age of 2 years, what does that mean? See, 2 years, by 2 years, we have said that very less chance of the person getting the tubercular bacilli. The child is generally at home. But if you are getting the induration, you can be sure that the child has got the infection, and if he has got the infection, he has also got the disease. Because in children, this reaction gives an indication that the child has got the disease, not only the infection, but he's got the disease, and so one requires to give him treatment. When you get a false negative, that's what this test requires a lot of interpretation. So false negative is when the disease is more severe. Severe, that means a severe tubercular infection has taken place. Again, the reaction of the body will be poor. Mediatory tuberculosis or disease or tuberculosis along with mumps, measles, chickenpox, HIV, you will get a false negative reaction. Like I mentioned about these measles, mumps, polio, attenuated viral vaccinations. If you're taking the vaccination, you can land up with a false negative result. Again, this reaction is what? It's basically a reaction by the body. It's a protein reaction, immunological reaction. If your immunity is low, protein energy malnutrition is due to protein energy malnutrition leads to decreased immunity. Or you have some problem with your lymphoreticular disorder, you can still get a false negative reaction. Corticosteroids as such lead to immunosuppression, and hence the intake of corticosteroids should be considered with caution. When a negative reaction should be taken with caution. If you use a faulty technique or improper storage and dilution of tuberculin, or you have denatured or contaminated tuberculin, or you yourself don't know how to read. Now, what happens in the pathogenesis of the disease? Droplet nuclei, the person inhales the infection goes. What happens? Microbiology. I wish I was in the class so we could ask what happens. Yes, there's a Ghon's focus which takes place, if you remember. A Ghon's focus. And then once the Ghon's focus takes place, please read up about the Ghon's focus. I'm not going to discuss about the Ghon's focus. Please read up about the Ghon's focus. These infection travel to the alveoli, tubercle multiply in the alveoli. You have the primary focus or the Ghon's focus which is formed. You have the lymphangitis and the lymphadenitis, and all these together we call as the primary complex. Primary complex. Ghon's focus, lymphangitis and lymphadenitis together is the primary complex. This primary focus which is there, what can happen to it? Either the immunoglobulins will come in, will neutralize this thing, and it will get healed. Once it gets healed also, you have a problem because this healing takes place with calcification. So, many of us have, if we take a chest X-ray, we find a lot of spots on our X-ray which are old gone focuses which have been treated and are now today calcified spots on an X-ray film. If the resistance is poor, then the lesion will progress, and what can happen when it progresses, later on there is the central portion of this gone focus, or for primary focus which is there, will get liquefied, and this liquefaction which takes place, or this caseation or caseation initially takes place, liquefaction takes place, this then will get expressed out, and once it gets expressed out, there will be a cavity remaining here and there will be sputum coming out there. So that is how you get the sputum as well as a cavitation which takes place. So what initially takes place? Once there is a primary focus, and there is a reaction of the lung tissue around this primary focus, what will happen? The reaction will be in the form of fluids being posted in, or there will be a firmness of the lung, and this firmness of the lung we call as consolidation. And once this consolidation, the caseation takes place and the sputum comes out, there will be a cavity formation. Now, once the sputum, this caseation comes out, it may come out person may it may come out as sputum, or it may remain in the lung and get more infection occurring, resulting in a reaction of the lung to this particular caseous fluid which has come out, and this reaction is called, it comes in as fluid formation and called pleural effusion. So that's also okay. Now once this cavity which is there becomes larger and larger, the lung, this cavity may later on just collapse, and this collapse is known as a lung collapse. So which are the things which can take place? One is a consolidation, one is a cavitation, one is a pleural effusion, one is a collapse of the lung. So all these can take place just because of what is the various stages of the disease. You can have pleural effusion can get infected, and you can get an empyema in the lung, which is there. So many things can take place with this. So we talked about it. Now also when we have this caseous tissue, this caseous tissue may burst into the lymphatic, and once it goes into the lymphatic, it goes all over the body, and so many organs of the body, the kidneys, the spleen, the various other organs of the body can get infected, and this is what we call miliary tuberculosis. So as I mentioned, it can go into the lymphatics and go into the brain, kidney, bone, other organs of the body, and sometimes this can result in tubercular meningitis, a very dreaded disease, especially in children. Tubercular meningitis is a very dreaded disease. Please read up about tuberculosis meningitis. We will not be discussing here. Mainly it is basically a job of the physician to teach you that. Tubercular meningitis and renal tuberculosis, please read up about it. People who are exposed to tuberculosis may not develop tuberculosis infection. See, your body resistance will take over, and then you may not develop the infection. People with tuberculosis infection may or may not develop TB disease. And the risk of developing TB disease is highest in the first 2 years of infection, especially in childhood. Because the immunity is not too good, and that's the time when the child develops the disease, and then childhood tuberculosis is a big problem. So we talked about this negative to skin reaction and positive to skin reaction. Positive skin reaction means he has got tubercle bacilli with him, and this tubercle bacilli can remain latent, or he can develop the disease. So active versus latent disease, unhealthy person, bacilli overwhelm the immune system, bacilli break out of tubercles in alveoli and spread through bloodstream. This is active tuberculosis compared to latent disease. So this thing is initial infection controlled by the immune system, so then the person remains as a latent case. Then they remain, if the immune system overwhelms this particular tubercle, and then it gets healed by calcification. So this is the difference between latent tuberculosis infection and active tuberculosis disease. Latent infection person doesn't have any symptoms. Active tuberculosis has got symptoms, may have cough, pain, chest, coughing, sputum, weakness, fatigue, weight loss, no appetite, chills, fever, sweating, and a latent disease person does not feel sick, cannot spread the tuberculosis bacilli, usually has a positive skin test, while a person with active disease may spread the TB bacillus because he is open to this, may have a abdominal chest X-ray or maybe positive sputum smear. Symptoms of tuberculosis are mainly cough, which is chronic in nature, with or without baptises, chest pain may be there, may not be there, fever, evening rise of temperature was what used to be mentioned, but not necessarily classical. So absence or evidence of disease is not, this is a very interesting statement, absence of evidence of disease is not the evidence of absence of disease. I hope you can get it. A person who is not diseased does not mean that he is not infected. That's what it means. It means that if you got if you are been proven by an X-ray that you or by sputum examination that you are not having the disease, does not mean that you do not have the infection. Thank you. We will cover only up to this lab diagnosis, and we will go into RNTCP after in the next lecture. Thank you very much. You must have these statistics of tuberculosis, malaria, all these chronic diseases very readily available. Latest data is very important. Look at SRS data or go to the sites. You can go to the government site.